Welcome to the Ridgecrest podcast. This is where we take time each week for a deeper look into the previous Sunday's sermon. My name is Matt. I'm the executive and discipleship pastor here at Ridgecrest. And as always, join with me is our senior pastor, Michael Estes.
Good to see you today.
Good to see you. Did you have a good weekend?
Yeah, it was a relatively quiet weekend. Got to spend some time playing Skull King with some friends.
Nice.
So I have not won since that one night that I sent you a picture. So for context, Matt and Whitney had us over at one point, and we played this card game called Skull King, which is a lot of fun. And we went home and got the game and started playing as a family. And there was a night where I absolutely destroyed my entire family. I felt kind of bad, like almost felt bad. And then since then, I haven't won once, and I think it's a pride issue. God was trying to remind me, hey, you're not as good at the game as you think you are. You got lucky one night. So
that's good. So who is the reigning champ?
Let's see. The last time we played as a family, I'm pretty sure Michael won. But it's been kind of like we've had different people win just about every single time.
Okay.
So it's either we're all really good at the game or we're all kind of bad at the game, and so it's just a matter of who's better than everybody else that night.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it makes it competitive. So it doesn't really matter who's good or who's not, as long as
it's a lot of fun.
You're having fun, and it's a lot of fun and good easy game. Like you said, broad range of kids can learn it, and it's a neat game.
Yep.
So it's interesting you talked about the idea of pride. We're going to get into that in a little bit into the podcast as this week you jump into the final chapter of 1 Peter. And I guess the penultimate of the sermon series.
Yeah.
And kind of looking at leadership. And so that's what kind of we're going to look at this week in the podcast. But to get started, one of the key aspects that you talked through in the sermon was this idea of empathy. And the question I have is, what are some practical ways that we can show empathy? And the reason I ask that is because I know, like, the sermon you use the illustration of someone being in a hole and then getting down in that hole with them, and that is a great example of empathy, which I think is fantastic. But the question is, along those lines is, how do we show empathy in some of those situations that maybe we can't get in? And kind of you touched on emotional intelligence and things like that, and which I think plays into that. But like if someone is in prison. I'm not necessarily going to go break a law so I can get into jail with them and so I can empathize with them in that. Or,
we wouldn't advise that.
or whatever it might be. If someone has lost a loved one, that each one of us are going to interpret that loss differently. Even if I've lost the same kind of loved one as they have lost, that emotional intelligent piece comes in where they might process it differently because of the different relationships and things like that. So the question is, how can you kind of practically show empathy? Perhaps in some of these situations, or even other situations that would really that we really might come up against.
Yeah, I would start by saying that you need to understand that this is something that there's not a one size fits all. So like you brought up the idea that everybody processes things differently. Emotionally, we're very different. All of us are very different people. And we need to realize that and be fine with the fact that like there are going to be some people that are never really going to cry much as far as just the way they respond to different events. But there are going to be other people that cry much more easily. And it's not that one way to do that is right and the other way is wrong. It's more like the way we process those things are just different. So knowing that empathy is really kind of a messy thing. And what I mean by that is it requires. It's not simple. It's really complex, and it's complicated in its approach. And so you think about the way Jesus dealt with different people when it came to kind of his response of empathy. There are times where he's very gentle and kind to people. He allows them to get close. Like I think about the times where he has lepers come to him and ask for healing, and like. A practical way of showing empathy to them is he actually touches them. There are other times where he has conversations with people as opposed to physical touch that normally people wouldn't have conversations with those sorts of people, like the Samaritan woman at the well, right? The disciples see him talking to this woman. They're shocked that he would have this conversation with this person.
Yeah.
So that was a way of. Now, what he says to her is pretty brutally honest. I mean, like, he's like, when she says, "I don't have a husband," he's like, "You're right, you don't. You've had 5."
Yeah.
And like he's really brutally honest, but the fact that he is with her in that conversation and he respects her enough to actually have a conversation with her as opposed to just dismissing her.
Yeah.
That to me shows that Jesus really understood people well, and was able to connect to them on an emotional level, because he paid attention and he knew what they needed. So, with all that said, I think like from a practical standpoint, I mentioned this in the second service, did not mention it in the first service, because I wanted to try to make the concept of empathy as clear as I possibly could. You know, something that a lot of us have. I won't say all of us, but a good number of us have, because if you're listening to us, chances are you're listening on something like Facebook or YouTube, social media.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say I'm scrolling through my social media feed and I see that a friend of mine finds out that a family member has, or they themselves have cancer. Okay. Our typical response, if we are very, if we're kind of dealing with things superficially, we feel pity for them. We feel bad that that's the situation they find themselves in, and then we continue to scroll, right? I mentioned that sympathy is, okay, I see this, I'm going to comment, and I'm going to let them know that I'm praying for them, I'm going to let them know that I'm thinking about them, that sort of thing. That's a good response. It's not bad.
Yeah.
There's a lot that people can be encouraged by through something like that. An empathetic response is, I know this person well, I'm going to call them, and I'm just going to talk to them and see what they need. If they're, and what you do at that point is you respond to what they allow you to do. So like there are going to be different levels of vulnerability that people are going to allow you, and as you gain trust, you're going to be able to do more and more. And so empathy then becomes things like, well, I'm going to drive you to your next appointment. I'm going to mow your yard because right now you're dealing with the effects of chemo and you can't do that. And so I'm going to do that for you. And I think that's probably the best way to think about like practical ways to show empathy is there are all these different things that we have to do as a part of our regular life. And if we were in a situation where those things became very difficult to do, you know, one of the things that could be really helpful and a way of getting down the hole with us is to take care of those things for us. That's one of the things that we do. I mean, Baptists, Southern Baptists in particular, people who live in the South, are really good about like, okay, somebody has a baby, what do? We all make meals. Yeah. Right? And take meals to them forever. And they have meals for months because they can put them in the freezer and that sort of thing. So, you know, that is an empathetic response, a very practical one. But sometimes it's just, I'm gonna go over to my friend's house. I'm just gonna sit with them. We're not gonna talk about anything. We're just gonna sit together. And if they want to talk about stuff, we're gonna talk about stuff. If not, we're gonna sit together and just be together. I think about if you want to have a really good picture of the difference between pity and sympathy and empathy, just look at Job's friends. Yeah, they are not empathetic. Right. They are barely sympathetic, and most of what they feel is this really condescending pity. And they look at Job, and they're like, "This is really all your fault, man. Like, what did you do?" And so, you know, they go and sit with him for a little bit, but then they're just like, "Now we got to open our mouth and say a whole bunch of stuff," and that's not empathy. Yeah. Empathy is just, I'm going to be here with you until, and if you want to talk, we're going to talk, and if you just want to sit, we're going to sit, and so from a practical standpoint, it varies from person to person, and I think a lot of it is about levels of vulnerability and whether or not people are willing to let you in. Yeah,
I think kind of how that demonstrates is it's almost this progression of action, not necessarily a progression of fixing it,
right?
But
because that's not what you're trying to do with empathy.
That's right, you know, and so you start out with pity. There's not really much action that takes place there. Right. You see someone hurting and you feel sorry for them. You know, that's about it. Sympathy, as you mentioned, you might make a comment. You might send flowers in the passing of a loved one, or send them a card of encouragement. You know, something like that. You know, so you have this. Pity. There's very little, if any, action. Sympathy has a little bit more action, but then empathy has even more so to where, as you mentioned, now I'm going with them to their doctor's appointments, or while they're walking through the arrangements of this loved one that passed away, offer to go with them and just be there for them. I'm not there to try to dictate or tell them or fix the situation. I'm just there with them. And so while the individual, and that's going to depend on the relationship too, while someone we have a close relationship with, like you mentioned, is going to be a little bit more vulnerable, as far as opening themselves up to allow how far in they allow you to be or empathetic. And so you have this kind of balance of, we could jump into it and say, I want to be as empathetic as possible, but it also has to be on the other side of it is, and I think that's part of learning to be empathetic is respecting those boundaries as well and figuring out how much, action is needed, or is it a time when the most empathetic thing I can do is just to volunteer to be there and just sit with them, and just to be with them through whatever it is that they might be facing.
Yeah, and I mentioned this is not old man Michael speaking right now, but I mean I'm gonna be kind of curmudgeonly for just a minute. Like one of the things that social media does to us is it desensitizes us to the pain of other people because it's blended in with all this other stuff. So like somebody makes an announcement on Facebook that their marriage is in trouble, or they're sick, or they have a family member that's passed away, or whatever. And that's right next to somebody who shared a funny video about cats, or a conspiracy theory, and so like all of that gets melded together and blended together into this thing. And now all of a sudden, like I no longer emotionally know how to feel about all these things together.
Right.
Like it doesn't. There's all these disconnects, and so that's one of the things that social media has. I mentioned that social media has a very negative impact. It's been proven to have a very negative impact on our empathy, is because, I mean, like we can't respond emotionally to all these things.
Sure.
And even if we could, it would be so emotionally draining that it would be difficult for us to do it in a way that's very genuine and very helpful.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that to say stop using social media. I'm saying that to say be careful about how you use it, because what it can do is it can really affect the way you respond to other people emotionally. Plus, you lose the face-to-face aspect of this is a person that I'm talking to.
Right.
And you like one of the things I have a tendency to be. I'm not very good at talking on the phone because I pick up on physical cues from people. That's one of the things that's one of the ways I have a tendency to figure out how I'm going to respond next. And you don't get those on the phone or on social media. It's simply like I'm trying to read as much into this thing as I can, and that's usually not very effective.
Yeah. I think it's really good, and I think empathy is something that we all can do a better job at. Because a lot of times I was having a conversation just a couple weeks ago with someone, and they were talking about how they're very empathetic, and then they started defining what they do to demonstrate their empathy, and I'm like, well, really, you just defined sympathy, and so it's interesting because I think a lot of times, just for the vulnerability aspect of it, sympathy is as far as we go. Even on our end, who maybe we aren't experiencing what they're going through, or whatever, we aren't the ones actually going through. We feel like sympathy is enough, but going that next step of empathy opens up a door of a lot of places of vulnerability for us, the other individual, and a lot of things. And so I think we can all do a better job, because truly the matter is when we're showing empathy, it's not comfortable, because if we're truly experiencing, we're inviting ourselves in to walk with them through whatever pain or struggle or whatever it is they're facing, and it's not a comfortable place to be. It's a lot easier just to be sympathetic and send them some flowers, and so I think it's something where we can all be challenged. Kind of pressing on, continuing to look at this idea of leadership. I love leadership. I've studied a lot on leadership. It's this particular passage is really a sweet spot for me, and just some of the previous studies and stuff I've done. And one of the key aspects you brought up was Christian leadership is responsible and to the righteous shepherd. I think it's incredibly important, because that was one of the things that really stood out to me whenever I was working through my coursework and stuff, and understanding what that meant, and kind of looking at what it means, A, to be a shepherd, and B, to understand that, Jesus, is our chief shepherd, and we're kind of these under shepherds who, lead, under his guidance and those types of things. And so really what caught my attention in all of this is this idea of learning to embrace the desire or position of leading from the second chair. And so those of you who maybe aren't familiar, but essentially what that means is, places of leadership, you have typically your CEO or president or whatever it might be, and then you have this second chair position, like your vice president, your whatever, assistant manager or whatever. You have all these kind of second chair positions. And a lot of times those second chair positions are kind of looked at as, well, that's okay until you can get to that first chair.
Right.
And a lot of times that second chair, people who are in that chair, it really requires some different thinking and different perspective of that. Well, within this realm of Christian leadership, I think, it's very clear that we as Christian leaders are second chair to Jesus. And I think, that's exactly where we're supposed to be. And, the temptation, I believe, is there for us to try to feel as though we're in that first chair at times. And I think the examples that Peter uses here as far as saying you should lead like this instead of like this, I think the ones who are leading in the way contrary to what he's speaking are ones who have embraced this idea of, well, really, I'm the first chair. And so Jesus has kind of entrusted me with this, and this is my role now. Yes. So I say all that kind of to preface the question, what are some of the dangers of not recognizing that Christian leaders, we are always leading from that second chair?
Yeah. I think it starts with understanding, like, the difference between leading from the second chair and leading from the first chair. And you've mentioned a bunch of these. One of the things that, like, if you lead from the first chair, literally you're setting priorities. You're saying these are the things that matter to us. This is what's important to us. And as Christian leaders, we have to understand that we don't set the priorities. Jesus does. He lays out for us the roadmap and the priorities. And it's our job to help people practically get there. To be able to do those sorts of things, but ultimately, we don't set the priorities, and so that's one. And I think one of the dangers of trying to lead from the first chair would be when my priorities become more important than the priorities that are laid out for us in Scripture.
Yeah.
I know at that point that I have started to wander off into an area that's dangerous for me, and for any leader. Yeah. And so basically I broke it down into two categories when it comes to the dangers of not recognizing Christian leaders are always leading from the second chair. The first is that it just sets unrealistic expectations, right? It puts too much power and puts too much faith in flawed humanity, flawed human beings. And what happens in a lot of cases, you can kind of see this as churches move through their history as a church. A church that has, and I'm saying this is, maybe the leader himself didn't do this, but the church did this in some way, shape, or form. Put a leader in an unrealistic place. All of a sudden, when that leader is no longer there, you see the church dramatically decline.
Sure.
You know that that's a church that was, whether the person or not intended it, that was led from a first chair kind of position.
Yeah.
Their priorities are what made the church go. The other thing, I'm going to make up a word here, is the idea of, and this kind of is related to the first thing, pedestalizing, putting someone up on a pedestal. And that's a problem in two different directions. It's a problem for the person themselves. So when somebody is put on that pedestal consistently and constantly and looked up to, and it's not that we shouldn't be looked up to, because, like, if you look at other places in the New Testament where it talks about leaders, like, it's told that we're supposed to set an example and we're supposed to do things in a particular way, and people are supposed to look to us as the example. But you have to also couch that in these people are still sinful human beings.
Yes.
And there's no excuse for, wandering off into immorality, and there's no excuse for being irresponsible with that leadership. But we have to understand that that's always going to be a temptation. That's always going to be the case. And so we have to be careful not to put somebody so far up on a pedestal that we encourage them to think in those ways.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, it creates problems for the congregational organization that does this. Okay.
Yeah.
Because when you go back to that idea of putting somebody up on a pedestal, when that person falls or leaves, you're left with this huge gap of what happened.
Sure.
Like, we've had multiple cases over the last year or so where we've had, people that were in positions of incredibly high leadership positions in large churches or large organizations that have fallen. Ravi Zacharias, posthumously, they've talked. There's been a lot that's happened there that's not good, and his ministry is going to suffer because of that. And part of that's because there was a lack of accountability. And P.S. That's one of the when I say problems for the person and problems for the congregation, that's one of the things that happens when you put somebody on a pedestal.
Yeah.
There's no more accountability.
Yep.
They're on an island by themselves. They can do whatever they want to do, however they want to do it, and
Sure.
there's really nobody that's going to question that. Because if you question that, I mean, think about it this way: you put a senior pastor up on a pedestal, and you basically say, this is the reason that things are going well right now. Anybody who questions that is seen as somebody who's dangerous to the mission of the church, or when in reality, like, we're told to confess our sins to one another. We're told to be accountable to each other and to look to each other and make sure that we're not straying and those sorts of things. And so, those are all things where anytime this kind of thing happens, it really is dangerous. And I think danger is the right word, because we need that accountability in our lives. We need people to watch us and hold us accountable and help us. And it starts with us understanding what we really are. We are under shepherds. We are not the chief shepherd.
Yep.
And that goes back to this idea of leading from the second chair. I don't set priorities. I don't get to make decisions about the way we do things, or the mission. God's the one who sets that up for us, and we follow through by helping people faithfully get there.
Yeah, that's good. And I think pride, is a big temptation there. Like as you mentioned, having a position that seemingly, as the world would look at, essentially, kind of here at Ridgecrest, as a senior pastor, you're kind of in that role of first chair organizationally, and so the temptation is there for an individual, so you have to be very mindful. And just for transparency, for me, that would be an area that I would have to really check myself in, and I would have to do that, because it's easy, to fall into that trap of, well, things are going really well, and it's because of me implementing this or that or whatever it might be. And then you have people, if they encourage you in that way or whatever it might be, and kind of, it doesn't take long for someone to get in that position of being on that pedestal. And so that's personally why I like kind of the position where I am at Ridgecrest, is kind of in that second chair to you as far as that goes. And because it allows me to, as a constant reminder of that relationship that we all as Christian leaders have, we to constantly remind ourselves that we're in that second chair to Christ, and it's okay to be in that second chair. We shouldn't just aspire.
Much prefer it.
Yeah, right. I mean, it just organizationally and everything works out much better when we recognize that Jesus is in control. He's set our mission, He's set our plan, and we just have to come alongside that and lead and guide those around us. Kind of as Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. Yes. And so along those same lines, a lot of times we can find ourselves in positions of leadership that either we've been put there because no one else would fill that position, or we're there for multitude of whatever reasons, but we kind of find ourselves in these positions kind of in this place of obligation. Like, I've got to do this because no one else will, or I've got to do this. Maybe it's a paid position, and it's like I've got to do this because I need to support my family, or whatever it might be. I think I would venture to say just about all of us have found ourselves in those types of positions at some point in our ministry, whether that's on a volunteer basis or on a staff basis. We probably all found ourselves in this place where we feel as though we're kind of doing this out of obligation. So the question is really for those individuals who might be in that position now. Maybe they're leading a particular area in the church. That they just feel like they're doing it because they have to, or maybe they're a place in their workplace or whatever it might be. And as a Christian leader, so if they're in this place of obligation, what would you encourage them to kind of do to either get out of that place and get to a place of being eager to serve, rather than viewing it as an obligation? Is that something they just need to give up and find somewhere else new? Do they just need to kind of recapture their focus? What's some encouragement you would give?
This is a tricky area because I believe strongly that the Scripture teaches the idea of persevering through things. And so I would say the first thing is, if you're struggling and it feels like obligation because things are hard, I would not say immediately jump to the conclusion that you're not supposed to be there. Man, struggling through hard things. You see leaders do that all the time in the Bible. Man,
Yeah.
Moses, 40 years in the wilderness with people that were stubborn and hard-headed and didn't want to do the right thing. Jeremiah in his ministry, prophesying for years and years and years and having no one listen to him.
Yeah.
Like, my guess is there were days where he'd get up and he'd be like, "Man, this is not what I signed up for."
Yeah.
But I mean, you can even look at the Apostle Paul, man. Like all the things that he went through in his life and the things that he struggled with. I mean, the description that he gives in 2 Corinthians, I think it's 11, where he just kind of or it's 10 maybe. He outlines, man, I was in the wilderness. Sometimes I had clothes, sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I had food, and sometimes I didn't. I was shipwrecked. I was beaten. I was stoned. Like all these different things happened to me that were really, really hard. But he still wanted to do those things, and he persevered through those things. And so, just because something's hard doesn't mean that all of a sudden, and it feels hard to do, doesn't mean that you're in a period where you're just doing things because you have to do it. That doesn't.
Right.
I want to be careful to clarify on that. But beyond that, I would say that if you get into a stretch where it's just like we're almost to Groundhog Day, where you get up and you're like, it's Groundhog Day again, you probably need to start praying through, okay, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Am I doing this because the pay's good, or I like my benefits, or I can provide for my family in this way? None of those things, by the way, are bad things. Like
Sure.
all of us, we want to enjoy those things in life. We want to, but if it ever gets to a point like the only reason I'm really doing this is because I don't want to have to go and find another job. I don't want to have to worry about my paycheck. I don't want to have to worry about whether or not I can provide for my family. At that point, it's time to reevaluate and start praying through, is this a wise place for me to stay? And to be really honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
Like that's a really hard thing to do, because none of us like change.
Right.
It is human nature for us to be comfortable with the way things are, and to be satisfied with things and not want change.
Yeah.
But the fact that I don't want change, sometimes, and this is something that I found to be true in my life, sometimes God puts divine discontentment in our lives to make us move. Because He knows we need change.
Yeah.
And so like if we get to that point to where we feel like I'm just doing this because I have to do it, because nobody else will do it, because I don't know what else I would do if I didn't do this, I think that's a spot where God probably is trying to get us to move.
Yeah.
And to do something different. And I think that's what you start to look for is am I going through like a really hard time and that's why this is difficult, or is this difficult because I don't love this?
Yeah.
I'm not eager to do this anymore. I don't find that passion in me. I don't. We also had to be careful too. I'll add one more thing. I had to be careful too about what we do with our emotional life, because there are going to be periods of time where like ministry is emotionally very hard, and so we're probably going to have periods of time where it feels really hard, but that I can't allow my emotions to drive me around. I like the way somebody put it the other day. I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about this idea of Emotions are like our children when we go for a ride in the car. We can't throw them in the trunk. We can't let them drive. We got to buckle them in the back seat, and they're there with us.
Yeah.
But we got to keep them strapped in the back seat and let them know what their actual place is. So I can drive the car, and so it's really important that we understand emotionally what's going on with us. And I think we need out. I will say this: if you're in a position of leadership, one of the things that's really dangerous for you, if you get isolated, you lose those emotional outlets. And I think I'm going to make a statement here. I think therapy is important for everybody.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that everybody should be in therapy all the time.
Yeah.
But I think that therapy is so good for everybody because there are so many things that we're just a mess.
Yeah.
And to have somebody come alongside us that loves us and that will speak truth into our life objectively as an outsider, just an essential part of what it means to be a person. And so, anyways, that's kind of a tangent to what we're talking about.
I think that's very relevant. And, I think, another kind of key aspect of that is thinking about your gifts and your gifting. I do think, I think gifting can change. I think God will, a spiritual gift we have today, we may not have in 3 years. Paul kind of talks about this idea of praying for, greater gifts, as he says, or praying for additional gifts and things like that. And I do think God can change that, and so depending on where we find ourselves and the needs we have as a church body, and having all those pieces in place, I do think God can gift us in different areas. And so sometimes while we may have had that spiritual gifting of XYZ, and we've been serving in that capacity, but now we've hit to this point of, I think maybe now God's gifted me in this area and is moving me here. We got to be okay to do that and not feel like we're just obligated to stay there. And, we did that with our life group leaders. We met with them, I guess, last week and kind of made that statement of, hey, if this is not where you believe God has gifted you in whatever role you find yourself in, it's okay to move to where God would have you be, and we as a church are terrible at doing that because we typically do vacancy filling rather than gifting use. And so there's a vacancy here, so here's an empty body that can fill that position, so I'm going to bring them over here. While that may not be where they're gifted for this point in time. And so I think we as a church need to be the leaders in that and be able to say, I want you to serve where you're gifted, not just because we have a vacancy here, because truth of the matter is, if we have a vacancy here and it's that important, God's going to provide the needs there, and so a lot of times we could be filling that place that needs to be vacant. So this person over here that God's been working on has a place to step into. So there's a lot of value in this idea of don't be in a place out of obligation because God could be at work, and the most healthy thing you can do is step away in that time and don't feel it as an abandonment or any kind of issue like that. Along this teaching of leadership, essentially this is kind of a shepherding leadership style. And if you can study that, there are tons of leadership styles out there. You've got authoritarian style, you've got more relational style, you have all sorts of different leadership styles, and you have a blend of all of them and things like that. The question is, do you believe that this model of leadership works regardless of personality type? And the reason I ask that is because we talked about this idea of emotional intelligence, how person A responds to something may be completely different than how person B responds to that. So the question is, do you think this leadership style can be utilized regardless of the personalities of those that they're leading?
I believe it can, and here's why. You look at the people that Jesus picked to be his closest followers. They were all really different types of people. You had some people that were fishermen and just kind of blue-collar, hard-working guys. You had tax collector. You had James and John, whose nickname was the Sons of Thunder. You have some interesting personality groupings in there. And yeah, every single one of them went out and did the things that Jesus, or that Peter was talking about here, that Jesus modeled for them.
Yeah.
So I absolutely think it can, and I think it can because it addresses at its very roots our humanity. It addresses our sinfulness. It addresses our natural limitations. If you look at what he's talking about, Peter addresses some things that we can fall into the traps of, things like being compelled to do something, like feeling that compulsion. Like there are personality types that, because they see that need, they want to help. I mean, that's okay. So we've talked a little bit about this lately. Enneagram. I'm a 2, which means I'm a helper. That means that if I see somebody with needs, one of my first inclinations is to jump in and help, even if
Yeah.
they don't want me to help. Like
Right.
I want to help.
Yeah.
And so, but I can find myself easily in a situation where I'm feeling compelled to help, but not doing it as willingly as I need to be.
Yeah.
That addresses the kind of the sinful part
Right.
of my humanity that needs to be addressed. Some people, like if you look at the next phrase, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Some people struggle with the part of power where they're like, this puts me in a position where I get something.
Yeah.
Right? I get something out of this. I get the praise of people. I get a really nice paycheck. I get whatever. Like, yeah, I get something out of this. And Peter's like, I know that's a temptation for you. You need to do this eagerly, eager to serve somebody. And then he goes on, not domineering over those in your charge. I know some of you are given to authoritarianism. I know that some of you think that the only way to lead is to tell everybody what to do, and they just need to bow to your authority, and that's how things are going to get done. And by the way, you can get things done that way.
Yeah.
But that's a sin. That can be a sinful way to get things done.
Sure.
It can be a broken way to get things done. And so he's like, no, you need to be examples. And so all of these things address different parts of our sinful humanity, which means that every one of these people that he's talking about here can be people that can be changed so that they can lead in this way.
Yeah.
And the very best parts of some of those things can come out. So like if somebody is incredibly charismatic, and they can use that to manipulate people, in a sinful way, but all of a sudden they find themselves under this type of leadership. Those typically tend to be the people that are really good at evangelizing. They have a gifting in that area a lot of times, and they can use it for the kingdom. And so, like, I think what it does is it addresses that part of us that wants to go off in sinful directions, and to deal with it. Also deals with our natural limitations as well. Like the fact that we're human beings. That we talked about. Leading from the first or second chair. One of the things that first chair leaders oftentimes do is they burn out. Part of the reason they burn out is because they don't recognize their limitations. This addresses your limitations immediately. You're not the chief shepherd. You're the under shepherd.
Yep.
So instead of stressing constantly about how things are going, you trust in God's sovereignty and knowing that He knows what's best.
Yeah.
So I think it addresses all those things and helps in those areas.
Yeah, and I think Jesus talks about the sheep know the shepherd's voice, and and the shepherd, of course, knows the sheep, and you can look at you have David, who was a man after God's own heart. I believe he was a man after God's own heart is because he was a shepherd, and all throughout Scripture you see God as this shepherd, and doing all these different things, and so I think we can learn that, and by having this kind of shepherding leadership style, I don't think that necessarily discredits pieces of other leadership styles. If you have more of a bend towards an authoritarian style, while the shepherding leadership style is much more biblical in what's shown, there are pieces that you can use depending on who you lead. I'm still going to be a shepherd to this person who might respond better to an authoritarian style, but I'm going to maybe use pieces of that, but my overall goal and focus is still to shepherd them and to lead them and to guide them and to lead by example and do these types of things, even if I know, I'm going to tell them they need to do this because that's what they're going to respond best to, but then follow that up with, hey, here's what this looks like, and really model that and really walk with them through that rather than just saying, well, here's a job, do it, and that's it.
To quote Tim Blocker, there are times when the shepherd has to use the staff to smack his sheep.
Yeah.
And so, like, there is a sense in which the authoritarian part of that can really be helpful.
That's right.
So, yeah, I agree with that completely, that idea.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to, again, the shepherd knowing the sheep.
Yeah.
Even within our staff, there are ways I would say things, to one staff member that I would say if I was communicating the exact same message to a different staff member, I would communicate that in a very different way. And that's where, leadership style doesn't have to change, but how we interact
Yeah.
with each individual, I think, is the thing that changes based on personality type. All right, so how if shepherding leadership style is more biblical and is universal, can be used universally. How can someone who's maybe in a position of leadership change his or her style to be more aligned with the scripture teaching?
Okay, so I think it's a 3-step process.
Okay.
And by the way, I think this is true of most change in our lives. First, you have to recognize that you're out of alignment. If you don't know that you're out of alignment, then you're not going to do anything to fix it, right? Same like driving your car down the road and you realize you're pulling to the left a little bit or to the right a little bit. You realize the car's out of alignment. Maybe you've been listening to this and you're like, okay, there are some places where I see the way I lead and I feel like I'm pulling to the right a little bit or pulling to the left a little bit. So you got to recognize first that you're out of alignment. Then what you want to do is you want to put people around you that are going to help you stay in alignment. And this is what I call accountability. After you start to make changes, you can't just, again, isolate yourself from other people and think, I can handle this. Again, you're not being honest about your humanity at that point.
Yeah.
And so you need to put people around you that when they speak into your life, that, hey, you're out of alignment here. It looks like you're moving in a dangerous direction, or that, maybe the way you're leading in this particular area, there is danger there. You've got to be willing to put those people in your life. And that requires humility. And by the way, we're going to talk about that next week.
Yeah.
If you go ahead and read a couple more verses in 1 Peter 5, you'll see really quickly that humility is an undergirding idea of all of what it's the very last thing that he wants to tell these folks is you got to be humble.
Yeah.
And so you got to put people around you. And then the last thing I would say is if you can't do these things, if you can't recognize that you're out of alignment, or if you do recognize you're out of alignment and you don't want to put people in place, you need to step away from leadership.
Yeah.
Because that tells me that you're not in a mature enough position to be able to handle that kind of, power, leadership, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
You're not in a position from a maturity standpoint to be able to do that and do it in a way that honors God and honors the people around you.
Yeah.
And so there is a sense in which, again, and that's a big step of humility to say, I can't do this and do it well. I need to step away from it. But and you don't want to wait till disasters hit and you've fallen, to get to that point. You want to do that before then because it saves you heartache and it saves all the people around you heartache as well. So I think those are the 3 steps. Recognize you're out of alignment, put people around you that'll help you stay in alignment, and then if you can't do those things, step away.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think that can apply within all of our areas. Whether it's in ministry, whether it's volunteer-based ministry, whether it be paid staff members, or even in the workplace, in the secular workplace, these principles are very much in line. It's I have a passion for helping individuals recognize the ability to be a Christian leader in the world, but because it's easy to be a Christian leader and work for the church, but we've got to have more individuals who are Christian leaders in the secular workplace to demonstrate and be different. I think if a Christian leader lives the way that First Peter kind of spells it out, as well as other places in the Scripture, if those leaders flood the workplace, people are going to be drawn to that, and they're going to want to work for that guy or that woman, and they're going to recognize that there is something different about this individual's ability to lead because he or she is submitting to Christ as the shepherd, and all the other responsibilities that we have is going to kind of fall under that, and then I think it's going to draw people to him. And so if that's you, maybe you're in a position of leadership, maybe it's volunteer-based, maybe you're in a paid position of leadership in your workplace, whatever it might be. Look for the opportunities to make sure you're aligned with what Scripture teaches. Have those people around you with that accountability to help hold you to that. Find some good, solid, mature brothers and sisters in Christ in the workplace, and say, hey, I want to create a work environment that models what Christ would expect. And so and do that. And also if you're in a position of leadership and maybe you're in this place where the best thing you can do for your own spiritual health is to step away. then do it. You know, and don't be afraid, you know, of that, and you know, continue to grow, because we're all growing, you know, spiritually, and that's our encouragement here. And so, as always, if you have any questions, or as you continue to process some of this, if you just need, you know, someone to talk through some of this with, or maybe look at a very practical, you know, your particular situation, we're here for you. We'd love to talk with you through that and explore, you know, whatever guidance, you know, either one of us, you know, could provide, or any of our other staff members for that matter. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. But as always, we hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.